By the time we reach the end of this breakdown, you will understand exactly how Mercedes turned a compression ratio loophole into a championship lead by exploiting a specific thermal expansion property in their 2026 power unit that allowed them to legally pass cold inspection at 16.0 while running an effective ratio approaching 18,001 at operating temperature. This is not a story about vague engineering advantages or generic rule bending, but a precise timeline of how Article C5.4.3 was interpreted, challenged, and ultimately rewritten through a unanimous e-vote that fundamentally altered how every engine on the grid is now measured. The resolution to this technical dispute is locked into a specific regulatory change dated June 1, 2026, and we are going to walk through every step of how that deadline came to define the current title fight. But before we get to the unanimous vote that settled the measurement method, there is a much more uncomfortable question hanging over the paddock that nobody has fully answered yet. If the FIA conducted secret hot temperature checks and privately told Mercedes their engine was completely legal under the regulations as they stood at the time of testing, why did the governing body still feel compelled to force a mid-season rule change that effectively validated the rival's suspicions without ever issuing a penalty? That tension between private legality and public regulatory correction is the open loop we need to keep in mind throughout this entire analysis, because it suggests the true advantage might have been less about raw horsepower and more about forcing a political outcome that protected existing results. We know from confirmed reporting that Honda, Ferrari, and Audi formally challenged the Mercedes power unit, suspecting that internal engine materials were specifically engineered to expand significantly under heat to create a meaningfully higher effective compression ratio once the engine reached 130 degrees Celsius. Rivals estimated this thermal trick could be worth roughly 10 to 13 horsepower, with some reports suggesting the advantage could be even larger under specific conditions. Yet the FIA's own undisclosed compression checks prompted by this pressure resulted in a private confirmation of legality rather than a disqualification. So where does that leave us right now with the integrity of the current standings? The answer requires us to look past the headline accusations and examine the exact sequence of events that led Kimi Antonelli to lead the Drivers' Championship at the summer break with 209 points. A massive 50-point cushion over Lewis Hamilton and a 59-point lead over his own teammate George Russell. This performance gap is not theoretical, as Antonelli has already secured 6 wins from the season's first dozen rounds, including victories in China, Japan, Miami, Canada, Monaco, and Belgium, making him the youngest driver to ever lead an F1 World Championship standings in just his second full season. The sheer scale of this dominance forces us to confront whether the compression ratio controversy was the primary driver of this success or merely a convenient narrative for frustrated competitors who failed to optimize their own 2026 power units under the same all-new formula. Remember that the 2026 regulations introduced a much bigger electrical component than previous eras, which created fresh interpretation disputes over measurement methods precisely because there was less historical precedent for how these new hybrid systems should be enforced in practice. Engine temps spiked, rules lagged behind, politics filled the void. We cannot simply accept the loophole narrative at face value when outlets like GP Fans have published pieces explicitly titled around evidence that disproves the compression allegations, indicating a genuine split in specialist media coverage that mirrors the unresolved debate inside the paddock itself. The core of this entire controversy rests on a single sentence buried deep within the 2026 technical regulations, specifically Article C5.3, which established a maximum geometric compression ratio of 16.0 for any cylinder, but originally mandated that this measurement be taken only at ambient or cold temperature. This specific phrasing created a regulatory blind spot that Mercedes engineers appear to have targeted with surgical precision, designing internal engine components using materials with thermal expansion coefficients that would maintain strict compliance during a static cold inspection, while fundamentally altering their geometry once exposed to the extreme thermal loads of actual racing. At operating temperatures reaching 130 degrees Celsius, the effective compression ratio could theoretically climb toward 18,001, a figure that represents a massive thermodynamic advantage in extracting energy from the fuel mixture that simply did not exist for competitors adhering to a more conservative interpretation of the rulebook. Material science won, static rules failed, thermodynamics prevailed. But how exactly does one quantify an advantage that exists only in the transient space between a garage inspection and a race start? The estimated performance gain attributed to this higher hot running ratio varies significantly depending on who is doing the calculating, with rival teams and some media reports placing the benefit at roughly 10 to 13 horsepower, though other analyses suggest the delta could be substantially larger under specific high-load conditions where thermal efficiency translates most directly to lap time. It is critical to understand that these horsepower figures remain estimates rather than verified data points, as the FIA has never publicly confirmed a quantified performance benefit linked to this design philosophy. What we can confirm is that the 2026 power unit formula gave every manufacturer a completely fresh design canvas with a significantly larger electrical component than in previous years, which is precisely why interpretation disputes over measurement methodology became plausible in the first place. New regulations always create gray areas, and the absence of established enforcement precedent for measuring compression ratios in hybrid systems operating at vastly different thermal states than their predecessors meant that the letter of the law and the spirit of competition were temporarily misaligned. Have you ever wondered why regulation that seems perfectly clear on paper can become so contentious in practice? The answer lies in the gap between what is written and what is measurable, a gap that Mercedes seemingly navigated by treating the cold measurement requirement not as a permanent constraint but as a boundary condition to be satisfied before unlocking performance elsewhere in the operational envelope. Motor Biscuit characterized this approach in their coverage as clever engineering that operated within the legal framework rather than outright cheating, a distinction that matters enormously when discussing championship legitimacy. This characterization aligns with the FIA's own private assessment, which found the engine compliant under the regulations as they existed at the time of testing. Yet the persistence of rival complaints suggests that legality and fairness are not always synonymous in the eyes of the paddock. The technical reality is that thermal expansion is a fundamental physical property, not a manufacturing defect, meaning that any team with sufficient resources and metallurgical expertise could have theoretically pursued the same avenue had they anticipated the regulatory ambiguity. So where does that leave us regarding the competitive balance of the current grid? We must acknowledge that Ferrari faced separate turbosizing issues, and Aston Martin struggled with Honda's raw horsepower deficit, making it essential not to conflate these distinct power unit storylines into a single narrative of Mercedes' dominance. Each manufacturer faced unique challenges under the new formula, and isolating the compression ratio dispute from these parallel development struggles is necessary for accurate analysis. Design intent mattered, enforcement caught up, competition shifted forward. The fact that Mercedes deputy team principal Bradley Lord identified a reset around Baku in 2025 as the turning point for Antonelli's development reminds us that car performance is only one variable in championship success, even if it happens to be the most controversial one right now. The formal complaints lodged by Honda, Ferrari, and Audi were not informal paddock grumblings, but structured regulatory challenges that forced the FIA to conduct undisclosed compression checks on the Mercedes power unit at operating temperature, rather than relying solely on the standard ambient inspection protocol. These secret tests represented an unprecedented level of scrutiny triggered directly by manufacturer pressure, yet the outcome defied the expectations of those who had demanded the investigation in the first place. The governing body privately communicated to Mercedes that their engine remained fully legal under the regulations as they stood at the time of testing, a finding that should have theoretically ended the dispute but instead intensified the political maneuvering behind closed doors. Rivals pushed hard, tests stayed hidden, legality held firm. Why would competitors continue to agitate for a rule change after receiving confirmation that their rival's advantage was technically compliant? The answer lies in the distinction between what is permitted today and what is sustainable for the sport's competitive integrity tomorrow, a calculation that transcends any single technical directive. Shintaro Orihara from Honda acknowledged in his own statements that when they started running in Barcelona, they realized their performance was definitely poor compared to other manufacturers. Though it is vital to note this admission related specifically to Honda's separate power deficit and not directly to the Mercedes compression allegations. Conflating these two distinct issues would distort the historical record, as each manufacturer's 2026 power unit journey involves unique engineering challenges that deserve independent analysis. What makes the Mercedes situation particularly fascinating is that the FIA's private legality finding did not prevent the eventual regulatory overhaul, suggesting that the governing body recognized a gap between current compliance and future enforceability, even while validating the existing design. This duality created an environment where Mercedes could simultaneously be declared legal and treated as the catalyst for immediate rule clarification, a paradox that has no clean resolution in traditional sporting adjudication. Have you considered how rare it is for a team to win both the technical argument and the championship lead while still being forced to accept a rule change targeting their specific innovation? The unanimous e-vote by all 5 power unit manufacturers to approve the new measurement regime indicates that even Mercedes themselves recognized the necessity of closing the loophole they had exploited, transforming a bilateral dispute into a collective governance decision. No results were stripped, no points were deducted, the championship table remained untouched. This forward-looking resolution, rather than retroactive punishment, represents a deliberate compromise, chosen specifically to avoid relitigating whether the original design was legal while still satisfying rival manufacturers going forward. ESPN and the Judge 13 both framed this mid-season rule change as a pathway to preserve competitive stability without undermining the legitimacy of races already contested, a pragmatic approach that prioritized future clarity over past grievances. So where does that leave us regarding the relationship between technical innovation and regulatory response in modern Formula One? The secret hot temperature checks serve as a case study in how governing bodies navigate the tension between written rules and unintended consequences, using private validation and public correction as complementary tools rather than mutually exclusive outcomes. The fact that GP fans published evidence explicitly disputing the loophole allegations while MotorBiscuit characterized the same engineering as clever exploitation demonstrates that even specialist media could not reach consensus on whether Mercedes had found a genius solution or merely exposed a drafting error. Uncertainty persists here, narratives diverge sharply, truth sits between. This editorial disagreement mirrors the unresolved feelings within the paddock itself, where respect for engineering excellence coexists uneasily with frustration over perceived regulatory asymmetry. Bradley Lord's observation that seeing a driver in just his second season performing with such consistency and calm maturity is incredibly impressive reminds us that the human element ultimately determines whether technical advantages translate into championship positions, regardless of how controversial the underlying machinery may be.